I love working with students who are genuinely curious and who aren't hung up on already knowing how to do it. And I'm really lucky because that's who I get to teach. I'm teaching, in this community center, and I'm teaching community writing center, and in sort of like one-on-one situations. And what I love is when I figure out a way to respond to what they've written, and they get it, and they get excited about it, and they want to go back. They want to go back and write that over again. Like they get the piece of information or the piece of like style advice, and they can see why they need to get their characters talking to each other in that scene. For example, like when I see that click in a student's mind, it's lovely. And so it would. I'm not sure which question they would need to ask to trigger that. It's more like when they're receptive to learning, and when they've given me something to look at and I've responded, and I ask them questions when I'm going through, and like trying not to be prescriptive about it, and point out like what would happen here if, like that kind of thing. And then seeing them get excited about the questions. And I don't know, that's really exciting to me when they're happy instead of discouraged after feedback.
Okay, everyone, welcome back to Living the Next Chapter, podcast for authors, where we talk all things about writing and sharing stories. You get to meet some of the greatest authors in the world on the show, and today is no exception by any means. We are really excited to have on the show. Jody's here with us. We're going to be talking about her book, her journey, and she's got a lot of passion for what she does, the stories that she tells, and she's joining us today to share with us all things about what she's up to. Jody, thank you so much for making time to be here. Welcome to Living the Next Chapter.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's exciting to have you here. I like to start with this with everybody that comes on the show, because we have listeners around the world, and we have listeners from your community that listen to the show. So tell everybody where you are in this big world of ours.
I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and I've been here for a long time. I've been here for more than 30 years. So
it sounds like a beautiful place. I have never been there myself. I've done it searching and Googling and all that, but what a beautiful place to live.
It is. It's a beautiful place. We're surrounded by everywhere we go in town, pretty much, you can see little blue ridges of the mountains peeking through, and we get all the seasons. So you get a beautiful spring, a beautiful fall, kind of clammy summer, but also kind of a nice winter. I like it. It's a good place.
Good. Excellent. Let's start with your author journey, Jody. How did all this start for you? What was your origin that said, hey, I know I'm going to become an author? Like, what was that for you?
I think for a lot of people, I think there's a point later in their lives where they feel a call to doing something creative, and then I just never stopped doing that. So I always made little stories when I was little, and I just kept doing it, which is an interesting thing. So it was always part of my identity, even when it wasn't part of my job, and even when it wasn't occupying like the status that it occupies now, where it's most of what I do. But it was always there. And I remember a lot of people are going to be too old to catch the reference to Captain Kangaroo, who had like a kids show when I was growing up. I think it was on repeats by the time I was growing up, but he retired from that and went on to do talks with classrooms from every age, from kindergarten to college. And I remember him talking about it on NPR one time, where he would go into a kindergarten classroom and say, how many dancers do we have? How many poets? And the kids' hands would shoot up, and the older kids got, the fewer hands would come up, and the more tentative they'd become. So to me, there's something about, we're all creative, and we channel it differently as we get older, and I just kept that channel open. And I think we're also a storytelling species, so I think it's pretty normal to have stories we want to tell.
That's actually an interesting commentary on how kids grow up and how they start downplaying some of their identity as a dancer, an author, or a writer, any of those things. Why do you think that's happening? Why do kids seem to kind of walk away from some of the things they thought they would be when they were younger? What happens there?
Well, I think I don't know if it's humanity in general or if it's our culture only, but our culture is definitely very pragmatic and very what are you going to do with your life and how are you going to make money, and we're definitely a culture that doesn't value the arts in kind. So if you become an artist, you have to have a side hustle or be lucky, to have money from some other source in order to be able to afford to spend the time that it takes to really become good at it. So I think there's that element. And there's also the element that as we get older, we get wiser. So we see that what we're doing in calling, dancing, and poetry isn't the same as what this ballerina beside us is doing in calling, dancing. And we're able to kind of see where our strengths are. So I think some of the channeling away from creative pursuits is just recognizing that certain people's skills and desires kind of land in different places. But there's definitely a cultural part that's saying we don't value this as much as other kinds of work. So
I think just hearing a lot of no, a lot of, that's not a job, that's not how you make money, all the things you talk about, I think that kind of then takes our dreaming down a little bit. And I think as authors, we have to elevate that dreaming part of us. We have to go someplace that's not typically a normal place to go.
Yeah.
And we have to develop that. Any tips or tricks that you would say to a young author on how to keep that part of you alive and vibrant?
Yeah, it's find your space, find your time. It's one of those things that's really easy to say and a lot harder to do. I like to tell students that I work with students through a writing center and some freelance students. And I like to recommend that if you're working on setting a writing discipline or on a particular project, that you figure out a way to touch it every day. And you make a goal that's the size that you can reach rather than making the goal, I'm going to write a book in 6 weeks. Make the goal that I have this idea and I'm going to flesh it out this way by such and such. Make the goal bite size. And then as you accomplish each bite, you can make a bigger goal. But I find the biggest disincentive is just people picture the big thing and they can't picture something small enough that they can actually do, and then they get discouraged. So I'm all for finding the goal that makes you keep going. Whatever it is, just do the thing that gives you the energy to keep going. So that's, it can be different things for everybody.
To get past the point where it's writing is something that I do to writing is something that I am.
Yeah.
Like you said, touching it every day. You touch something every day and it's part of your routine. That's who you are.
Yeah.
It's not a task that you've added to your to-do list. That's who you are. It's how you identify.
Right.
So touch it every day. That's a good point. I like that.
Yeah. And that means it can be however it works for you to touch it. So I've been, a writer, obviously, since I was a little kid now. So I've heard so many different versions of advice, and there's a lot of people that want to tell you this is how you do it. And I find anytime someone approaches it that way, my brain just turns off and I don't want to do it the way that they're saying. It's just a reaction that's very native to me. So I try to figure out something broader. And I also really encourage writers in general to, a lot of times people fixate on, like, I'm going to get, this many number of words on a page today. And if that works for you, fantastic. No, I'm not knocking it. But I also feel like that sometimes prioritizes the flooding of words over the quality of what we're doing. And sometimes we need to spend a day or a week or a month really immersing ourselves in research about information that's going to be important for our stories, or in types of writing that we haven't done that we think this story is asking us to do. There's a lot of reading and researching and just interacting in the world that are essential to creating a believable writing voice in a real story to tell. So I call that letting it count. Let all those aspects of writing count instead of just the word count, and include them in what we expect the work will require.
Okay. How are you as a person developing and growing as an author? Like, what kind of things are developing in your own personal life just because you write?
Well, that's a good question. And having had my first book came out last year, excuse me, I'm going to clear my throat.
Yeah.
my first book came out last year, a collection of short stories. And one of the things that was just fascinating about the whole process was it showed me how much work I'd been doing up until that point to cultivate this writing community in my life and cultivating just a writerly world. So there were so many people who were there to celebrate with me, and a lot of them were writers whose work I had celebrated. And just I'm not articulating it really well, but I had created this world, and having the book come out showed me that. It showed me what it was, kind of reflected back to me the work I'd been doing for so long, especially in literary fiction. Like if you're writing commercial fiction or you're writing genre fiction, there's usually an automatic audience and somebody that will buy it, even if it's not a big publisher or whatever. And literary fiction is sort of the slimmest margin out there. So there's a lot of rejection. So I'm so sorry. I just lost my train of thought.
Yeah. So just kind of like how you're growing and what you're learning about yourself through the process of writing. Like, how is it like a mirror back to you on how you're growing?
Right. So it's a mirror back to me on how I've grown this community and surrounded myself with people who are involved in the same kinds of efforts, and having been able to pat them on the back when they achieved a great thing meant that there were a lot of people that were ready to pat me on the back. And it's not it's more complicated than what comes around goes around. I didn't do those things in order to get that to happen. But because I was involved, because I became very active as what I call, and what a lot of people call, a literary citizen, and I was doing book reviewing and interviewing authors and kind of trying to stay involved in the writing world, so that even if my book wasn't going to be part of that I could contribute to this thing that I believed in. So having that kind of turn around and give some energy to my own book experience was lovely, and it was definitely an emblem of how my writing life had changed. But of course, life experience changes you over time. And, like I find it very fascinating how much more I've read by now, how much more I've experienced by now, how differently I experience books that I go back and reread, and, how my lens on the world and my experience has kind of changed and broadened over time. So all of those things really make you continue to grow as a writer. But being involved in your own life and being involved in reading and writing is pretty important.
Yeah, somebody was telling me they kind of frame their writing around one of those sweaters that you have in your house where everything seems to stick to it. You're like, what is this fluff? Where's this hair come from? Oh, I got cats. All these things just kind of cling to you. Yeah. And they said, that's how I write. I just let life stick to me as all these things, and I can pull these off and go, oh, that time when I did the thing, and oh, here I traveled to this place, and I experienced this, and there are all these things that cling to them. Yeah. And it's kind of like that sweater idea and everything. Just let everything stick to you. And that kind of becomes your resource when you're writing.
That's a great metaphor. And I also think that most writers that I have ever met are sort of natural eavesdroppers. So we're always hearing conversations. And, it's nothing personal, strangers talking around me, but I'm listening. And sometimes what I love is listening to a fragment of a conversation that I cannot possibly ever learn the context to. The more out of context it is, the more interesting it is, because I can create the context. I can imagine why these people are engaging the way they're engaging. And I love that. I love just the mystery of it. I also love, and this is something I talk about a lot, when I was just waiting in line at the grocery store or something, and someone comes behind me in line, and they've run into someone they haven't seen in 3 or 4 years, and they're just going to run through a list of everybody's, birthday parties or, broken legs or whatever, and with this heightened enthusiasm around every announcement. And I love it because it's so the opposite of story shape. It's only interesting because these people know each other. There's nothing interesting about the stories except that these people care about each other. And to me, that really defines what story is more than those plots that revolve around things that are interesting because they're weird, or things that are interesting just because they're tragic. Like, it's interesting to me if we can make a story as vivid and important as those little crumbs of personal data that we're exchanging in a grocery store line. That's kind of where I like to find things, that level.
Yeah. And in that example, the relationship is the context for that conversation.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. So it's all about relationship, and then finding the nuance that makes this little fragment important. It's really interesting to me.
So as authors, we got to leverage that as we write to some degree.
Yeah.
Bringing the relationship into the context, right, for the reader.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. The characters and how they interact. And as a teacher, one of the things that I often say in workshop is, I've got a scene that someone is sharing, and their character's thinking, and they're thinking about what they're not going to say, and they're thinking about what they're not going to do. And I'm like, make them say it, make them do it. Interact and show me the character in relationship, because the relationship will tell me things that they don't know about themselves in their heads. And we can reveal things on the page that way that the character doesn't have to understand about themselves, but the reader can walk away having this wider experience of the character. So we need to figure out how to mine those things. I think as a writer, we often get into these moments where there could be all this chaos, and we're like, well, that's going to be too messy to clean up. So I'm just going to stay in this inside the head and make it all the things that aren't going to happen. It's kind of a reflex, but we need to make a mess. And then when we make a mess, the story gets better. All
right. So everyone go make a mess today when you're writing, and then go clean it up after the fact. So it's kind of like it's like as an author, you're kind of dealing with a toddler who just goes through your house and wrecks everything, and you have to put it all back. That's kind of what we're doing as authors. Okay.
Absolutely. And I actually often compare that to when I was teaching my kids how to cook, because, I can be a little bit of a neat freak and certainly a little bit of a germaphobe. Like, the idea of a broken egg all over the counter, all over the floor doesn't make me feel good. But I knew that if I was going to teach my kids how to bake and cook, I needed to just suck it up and just deal with it. So then the egg drops onto the floor, and I swallow all that down, and I say, "You're not cooking if you don't make a mess." So I feel like there's a lot of those similar feelings that we bring when we're writing these scenes, where we don't want them to fight on page 5 because we're really saving up for the fight that we want them to have on page 10. So we're going to keep it neat and tidy here because it needs to be messy later. And that's us being too much in control. If the scene is kind of giving us the opportunity to make a mess earlier than we wanted, then we need to figure out how to do it earlier than we wanted and make the story work that way. I think a lot of times people build the mystery into their stories by saving the reveal for later, when a really good story gives you the reveal on page 1 and you're still stressed and worried about it the whole way through.
So I feel like we're getting a master class today on writing. This is great. I can tell you've done this before. This is awesome. What kind of students do you love working with when you get to sit down with someone early in their author journey? What lights you up? What kind of questions do you love hearing from a new author that kind of help steer you as a teacher in this space? That's
a great question. I love working with students who are genuinely curious and who aren't hung up on already knowing how to do it. And I'm really lucky because that's who I get to teach. I'm teaching, in this community center, and I'm teaching community writing center, and in sort of like one-on-one situations. And what I love is when I figure out a way to respond to what they've written, and they get it, and they get excited about it, and they want to go back. They want to go back and write that over again. Like they get the piece of information or the piece of style advice, and they can see why they need to get their characters talking to each other in that scene. For example, like when I see that click in a student's mind, it's lovely. And so it would. I'm not sure which question they would need to ask to trigger that. It's more like when they're receptive to learning and when they've given me something to look at, and I've responded, and I ask them questions when I'm going through, and trying not to be prescriptive about it, and point out like what would happen here if, like that kind of thing, and then seeing them get excited about the questions, and I don't know, that's really exciting to me when they're happy instead of discouraged after feedback.
Yeah, when they're engaged with their writing and connected to what they're doing, and all those things are great indications they're on the right path.
Yeah.
So that's good. Okay, so let's switch gears and talk more about your most recent book coming out in September. I'm excited for you. Congratulations. Can you tell us more about what's coming in early September?
Yes, my novel Without You Here comes out September 10th. I think the pre-orders are actually already delivering, which is interesting because I have an event right about 4 days before the official release, so there's all kinds of printer logistics that go into it. So Without You Here is currently shipping. But it is always hard to get it down to, a couple of lines, but it's a story about Noreen and her aunt, who they have the same name, but the aunt goes by Noni. And they're really alike. They're different from the rest of their family. They're sort of whimsical. They're sort of prone to depression and other positives and negatives. So they kind of have the full emotional swing. So they're a little bit of outcasts in the family. And Noreen and Noni are very tight when Noreen's a child. And then Noni dies from suicide when Noreen is very young. And let me pause for just a second. Can I start that over again?
Sure. Yeah, no problem at all. Yeah.
That was just all over the place. So
no, that's fine.
I'm trying to get better at it. The hardest part always is like melting it down into like chewable bites. All right, so scrapping that.
That's good.
So Without You Here is my novel that comes out September 10th. And it's a story about the close relationship between an aunt and a niece. When the niece is very young, the aunt dies from suicide. And they are both very alike. They're sort of family outliers in that. And the story kind of traces the ripple effect of that loss through Noreen's growing up years, and until we land with her on the brink of the year 2000, stuck in a dangerous marriage where she's in a crisis that she has to solve. And we're wondering how the experience of her aunt and her aunt's particular troubles that she shares, how that's going to affect the decision that she'll make for her future. So that's really how it goes. It's particularly hard to describe this book because it shares point of view. We have chapters that are from the aunt's point of view and chapters that are from the niece's point of view, and they splice through time, back and forth through time, kind of around the fulcrum of the date of the loss. So it makes sense when you're reading it, but it makes it a little trickier to describe because when we have two voices telling a story, there's two trajectories we're dealing with as well, and the time period shifting through was a challenge to figure out how to make it work. So the structure was a challenge for me, trying to really nail down how to make this story work the way it needed to work. So
okay. So I'll ask you the question, and if I'm giving away something from the book, then please don't answer the question.
Okay.
But what is the initial connection between the aunt and the niece that brings these two together? Is there something to that story that you can tell us without giving away anything? Okay.
Absolutely. So they're both just kind of unusual. So they both have, physically they're pretty similar. They have very wild hair. They have kind of like shimmery green eyes, kind of unusual features that they share. The fact that they share these physical features kind of underlines for the rest of the family all of the kind of temperamental features that they share. And there is a history in the family. There's like an uncle / great uncle who also died from suicide. There's been pressure on Noni her whole life, the fear that she's going to be like him. And now there's pressure on Noreen, the fear that she's going to be like Noni. So they're bonded by being pretty similar in a family that's worried about those similarities. So it's kind of this they're at rest with each other, but they're not at rest with the rest of the world. So that's kind of how they originally connect. And Noreen is like she's 8 years old, but Noni is like 9 years younger than her sisters. So she's an aunt, but she's also kind of like babysitter age, not really next generation age. So there's a closeness there as well.
Okay. So what was the initial spark to write this book? Like, what was the initial thing that you're like, oh, I know what I'm going to write about?
It's a good question because when I look back, I see like a million different sparks, like that sweater you were talking about, things that stuck. Because one of the things was a story that I'd written about 25 years ago that really was a slice of the ending. Like the culminating scene, part of that was a short story many, many years ago that I was workshopping with a writer friend who said, I would like to see more of this story. And that stayed in the back of my head for, decades. And then slowly I started to see all of these other things possible for these characters and how because in the short story that the person who became Noreen, because she had a different name back in the day, but the person who became Noreen has this sort of feeling of a presence of someone who's not there anymore, and trying to create, like, how is that believable? How do we carry a loss that long where it feels that physically present in our present moment? Like, how do we do that? And so creating that was a lot of it. Then there were little other elements that, like when my parents were divorced when I was 5, and the last house they lived in together was this really old house in a small town in northwestern Virginia. And it was, people said it was haunted. So there was a sound that people heard, and it sounded like breathing. And it was usually in my parents' bedroom, but every now and then it would move around the house. Everyone they knew had heard it. Super creepy. After my dad sold it 6 months later, the people he sold it to called him up and said, why didn't you tell us there was a ghost? So something was up with that house. But my grandmother, when she came to visit, my mother's mother, when she came to visit, said that it sounded like a noose swinging. And I thought that was such a horrifying thing to say out loud to your child in their home. So like the starkness of that stuck with me, and I think just the sonic reality of that kind of stuck with me. So so that had to do a little bit with sort of the darker elements in the novel and Without You Here. So it was all sorts of things like that. And who knows what the story was with that house, but there was a sinkhole underneath it, and it has since been torn down.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So, yeah.
So okay. See, that helps as far as some context as well for the reader to understand why this book is in the world and kind of the origin story of how it was created. That's always curious. I love those TV shows, like how was it made? Right. I want to do that here on the podcast with the book.
Yeah.
To understand how this book was made. That's great. The launching of the book is interesting, the time-wise, for the month of September and the week specifically your book launches. Again, was it completely planned this way? More?
It was really circumstance. I mean, really, really happenstance. Originally, the book was slated to publish a little later, but things came together sooner and we pushed earlier. We didn't want to push too much earlier because I had a book come out last year and that started to seem too close. And we landed on September. And then as I was doing some research, I realized that it was National Suicide Prevention Month, and suicide does feature in Without You Here. I didn't set out to write a book that was about suicide or about mental health issues. I set about to write about these characters and what they were experiencing, and that and to do that well, I needed to dig really deeply into understanding the particular issues I was creating. So I did a lot of research. All of us probably have lost someone to suicide, whether we knew them very well or not. I know I have. So it's not that I wasn't making things right out of the sky. I wasn't making a prop out of somebody's tragedy, which is something that I really, it's a pet peeve of mine in writing when we don't fully flesh out really important issues that we're bringing into our stories. So it was very important for me to render this all very realistically. So it was interesting to me. It was fascinating that it ended up landing on National Suicide Prevention Week of National Suicide Prevention Month that Without You Here debuts. It seems really appropriate too, though. I think literary fiction's superpower is creating empathy around things that are hard to talk about. And so I think a lot of literary fiction makes us uncomfortable for one reason or another, but also gives us this valve to let off some frustration or angst or hurt that is hard to find another valve for in regular conversation. So I think literary fiction gives us this vehicle to sort of triangulate ourselves out of the room from our own tragedy and still be able to talk about it. And I think that's, like I said, I think that's a superhero power. A lot of medical schools right now are introducing, requiring fiction seminars for doctors in training to help build empathy. There's been many studies that show that people who read literary fiction have more empathy, that reading literary fiction builds empathy. So it really helps you get inside a character that you've not been inside of before. So that's kind of the gist. So that's kind of all of the kind of good luck to land on that month, because I think this book Without You Here can be a platform to talk about things that are really hard to talk about.
What is the overarching message of hope through the book?
To me, by spending the effort that I did to really create full characters and not just characters who were troubled. They're characters who celebrate as well. They're characters who love each other. What I wanted to do was deliver the fullness of a life. And it's the fullness of those lives and the love and the connection in them that I think are the overarching pull of the story. Like, I think that's where it comes from, is the positive propulsion, even though there's a lot of sadness in the story.
What's the most satisfying thing for you as an author when you think about this book being out in the world in September? What brings you the most satisfaction?
It's a funny thing for me for a long time, because these characters have been in my head for a really long time. The first version of this story was so long ago, and they've been kind of talking to me, in the way that literary characters talk to their people for so long. And I'm really excited that they'll be out in the world. And I was thinking today how they're probably the most vulnerable characters I've ever created, that they're really honest about their vulnerabilities. They're and they live in this constant tightrope between being okay and being not okay. They're always kind of, because they have so much sensitivity to the world. And those were tricky characters to write and to really bring the reader into and have the reader embrace. But I'm really excited to see what their vulnerability will bring to other people.
It's amazing. I think I could talk to you all day, but I know you have other things to do besides talk to some guy in Canada on a podcast. But I do enjoy talking to you. I love all of the amazing information you're giving to our authors as well. Again, like I said at the beginning, it feels like a little master class that we're getting from you. And I'm sure people are going to be listening to this over and over again just to take in all this great information you've been giving to us. And I'm excited for this book to be in the world. This is exciting.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. It was great fun.
So let everybody know where we can connect with you, where you're active online, where they can continue the conversation from here, and again, where the book will be available in September.
Absolutely. So I am at jodyhobbshesler.com, which is JODYHOBBSHESLER.com. And I'm on, I still call it Twitter, and I will continue to call it Twitter.
Thank you.
And I'm at JH Hesler. And I'm on Facebook, and I think you just search my name and you'll find me. And I'm on Instagram as Jody _Write, WRITE _now. The book's available anywhere that you get books. You have to order it through your bookstore. It's not going to be on the shelves. It's a really small book publisher, really small independent press doing the good hard work. But it's on Amazon. It's on Bookshop. It's everywhere. I always recommend, if you can, please go to your independent bookstore and order it directly through them. They can get it easily. It's in all of those like delivery mechanisms, whatever. But I support the indie bookstores. So.
Yeah, as we all should. Thank you for that. Talk a little bit about your publisher. Let's give them a little praise here at the end as we wrap up. We like to send more authors to them as well, but tell us about who you worked with and maybe some of the things you learned by working with them.
Absolutely. Flexible Press is a small independent publisher out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. They started as a writing group, actually, and they met down the street from a bodega they all really liked, and the bodega burned down, and they banded together to try to figure out how to raise some money to help rebuild. And they published an anthology of their local writers' works and made several $100s for the bodega to rebuild. And they loved the feeling so much, they decided to keep that mission and to choose books that have some kind of social relevance and contribute 10% of their proceeds to any like nonprofit the author chooses. So for my book, it's the Suicide Prevention and Resource Council of a local Charlottesville mental health agency. So I'll be making a donation, and the publisher will be channeling profits toward it. So,
well, that's worth buying the book right there to help support, right, and be part of that. Again, I'm so happy that you've written this book, that it's out there as a resource for people. I know in that month, particularly in September, people's attention will be at the subject of the month and sharing stories and helping each other. And the fact that your book launches I don't think this is a mistake or something that just happened. I think this is planned somehow. And I'm so excited that this is coming into the world for all of us to enjoy.
Thank you.
Keep us in mind, as I know, as I talk to one author and the next author, that there's always another project coming down the road.
Yeah.
There's always a new thing to talk about. I would love to have you come back and be part of the podcast in the future and give us an update on the book, how it's doing, and any new works that you're doing as well. Please keep us in mind and add us to your calendar.
Fantastic. I would love that.
Excellent. Everyone, all the information for Jody's in the information in the show notes. You can click on there and all the links she's mentioned are there for you. Buy the book through your local independent bookstores. Let's support them. Just keep those doors and lights on in those little beautiful buildings that sell these books in person. And let's keep supporting our authors. Jody, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Hey, thanks for being here for the Living the Next Chapter podcast. So glad to have you as part of our family of listeners. There's a seat for you just here on Living the Next Chapter, and I'm so happy that you have listened to all the way to the end. Wow, you are now my new bestie. I want to let you know that I host 7 other podcasts on top of Living the Next Chapter. Yep, 8 total. One of them is called the How To Podcast series. If you are thinking, you know what, Dave, this podcast thing seems like a lot of fun, well, I'll give you a secret. It is. It's a great, amazing, fun time where you can get to meet great people, get your word out there, promote your book, promote what your coaching program, whatever you're doing. Podcasting is great. And if you want to learn how to do this, what you're hearing right now, head over to howtopodcast.ca and look up the How to Podcast series on YouTube, whatever app you're listening on. You'll find me there. And I'd love for you to come listen to how to do this. And if you're interested and have questions on how to podcast, reach out to me at howtopodcast.ca. Thank you for listening. Talk soon.